be seated. We are about to begin our next session titled Air, Trade and Interstate Relations. The speakers are Syed Salim Raza, Najmuddin Sheikh and Masooma Hassan. The moderator for this session will be Waqar Ahmed. Please switch off your mobile phones or put them on silence mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. We would appreciate if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. Our moderator for this session, Dr. Waqar Ahmed, is Deputy Executive Director at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. He is a former advisor to UNDP and has undertaken assignments with the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Ministries of Finance, Planning and Commerce in Pakistan. He has published extensively in areas such as macroeconomic modeling, inclusive and sustainable growth reforms, trade and taxation policies, regional trade agreements, trade in services, energy governance, and border-related trade infrastructure. Waqar.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. I welcome you to this post-lunch. Hopefully, some of you may have had their lunch. So, post-lunch session on aid, trade, and interstate relations. As many of you know, there is some interlinkage, of course, that has been drawn in the literature, in the policy, of course, circles. But we have three eminent speakers who are going to talk about this. We are honored to have with us Dr. Masooma Hassan, who is a noted scholar, diplomat and civil servant. She is chairperson of Pakistan Institute of International Affairs, President, Board of Governors of Audit Foundation and National School of Public Policy. She also served as Cabinet Secretary to the government and Pakistan's ambassador to Austria, Slovenia and Slovakia. We're also joined by Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh Saab, who's a senior and distinguished diplomat, served in the capacity of Pakistan's ambassador to Canada, Germany, USA and Iran. He was also the Foreign Secretary between 1994 and 1997. I also have the honor of introducing Syed Salim Raza Sahab, who is an eminent economist and banker. He was CEO of Pakistan Business Council, Governor of State Bank of Pakistan, currently also teaches at IBA Karachi and serves on the boards of several corporate and government entities. Now, the way we were trying to choreograph amongst ourselves, when we were trying to communicate over the email, while we were trying to establish linkages between aid, trade, and interstate relations, there were a couple of questions on the table. We, of course, want to discuss in this very brief time that we have whether increased trade and aid diplomacy leads to improved interstate relations. Can economic interdependence between countries promote regional peace? How effective has been foreign assistance in improving people's perception about donor countries or development partners in general? And then, of course, we wanted to hear from Mr. Salim Raza Saab how, given the opportunity of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, one could overhaul the institutional capacity so that this opportunity is more efficient in its delivery. CPEC will also be touched a bit by Dr. Masooma Hassan Saiba, of course, who will bring on board some security concerns, regional peace and people's concern, and we'll also be listening on the same subject from Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh Saab. Now, the format that I would like to keep is that for the initial 5 minutes, I give initial 5 minutes to each of these three very distinguished speakers for their general remarks on the subjects. And then I come in with some questions, but there'll be more questions from your side for our honorable panelists. So if I can start from my extreme left and invite upon Dr. Masooma Hassan for her initial remarks, please. Dr. Saiba.
Thank you, Waqar, for giving me the floor. And with respect to the impact of aid, a question that is often asked is whether aid is a curse or a blessing. And you can answer that question in the light of the data which you choose to address yourself to. But I would like to make a few general remarks about aid, few general observations, so that Pakistan's case can be put in a global perspective in which I think it should be viewed. The first point I want to make is that no country, no donor country, gives aid for altruistic reasons. Aid is given by donor countries in pursuance of their strategic interests. Aid is a reflection of their foreign policy objectives. Since 1970, none of the rich countries of the world, except a few, have been able to honor their commitment which they made in the United Nations General Assembly that they would donate or give 0.7% of their gross national income to the developing countries or to the poorer countries. The only rich countries which have met that target are the Scandinavian countries, some of which have crossed it, and the United Kingdom. In fact, if you take a total tally of what they should have paid since 1970, they have not even doled out half the amount which was due. Aid can be a difficult matter for recipient countries to handle because of the conditionalities which are attached to it. These conditionalities can vary, and strong governments in recipient countries can negotiate better deals. Weak governments in the receiving countries often fail to get good terms for themselves. What are these conditionalities which Pakistan has also faced? One, often free trade is forced on the recipient country. Two, the recipient country has to get goods and services from the donor country at overpriced, highly priced values. Thirdly, it has to get overpriced technical aid. Fourthly, it has to accept consultants, engineers, architects from the donor country at exorbitant rates, so much so that it is said, there is a study, which says that of every $1 paid by the United States to a donor country, 84% go back, either through overpriced goods and services or through consultants' fees. Also, there is a tendency, for which the recipient countries are also responsible, of investment in very big mega projects, which involve billions and billions of rupees, and which therefore create opportunities for corruption and for siphoning of funds and for lack of transparency. It is also said that the powerful domestic groups within a country dictate the way that aid is dispersed. Therefore, the question to ask is, what is the impact of aid? Does it reach where it has to reach, where it should reach, that is, to the poorest of the poor in the receiving country? And very often, the answer is in the negative. This question has been raised by analysts, by government functionaries, by economists, by social activists. Is aid going where it should go? Is it helping the poor to become better in their lives? Are their livelihoods improving? Is their condition of living better? These questions have been raised also by a very famous economist, Angus Deaton, who was last year's Nobel laureate in economics. Deaton is based in Princeton. He was educated at Cambridge. He is British by birth, American by choice. And he has raised this question in his books, for which he got the Nobel Prize. He has worked on inequality, he has worked on poverty in India and in the African countries. And he has said that because of the enormous amount of funds involved in these transfers, the enormous amount of funds involved. These funds corrupt the governments of the receiving countries and leads to lack of transparency, and he also believes that very often the poor become poorer. If we compute all the aid which Pakistan has received from various sources, multilateral aid from the IMF, from the World Bank, from the Asian Development Bank, bilateral aid from the United States of America, from China, from the European Union. By the way, the European Union is the biggest giver of humanitarian aid in the world today. After the end of the Cold War, the emphasis shifted from security concerns to more humanitarian concerns, and now a lot of aid is given to fight terrorism also. So if we compute all this aid which we've received from all these countries, including Saudi Arabia, including the United Kingdom, including China, there should have been a social revolution in Pakistan. But unfortunately, our indicators, our social indicators, are far below the required levels. And we are, in many of them, right at the bottom of the list, sometimes in more unfavorable positions even than the poor countries of Southeast Asia or some African countries. I think I'll stop here, Waqar, and we'll
Thank you.
take up other questions as they come along.
Thank you, Dr. Saiba. I think your remarks were also a reminder for the global community whether aid has worked or not, and you rightly pointed to Deaton's work on aid effectiveness, which is very closely linked with lack of transparency. Now, I understand that Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh would have been involved in many such aid negotiations on behalf of the country. And one thing that Ambassador Saab that we see is that if you look at 45 to 50 years of Pakistan's aid history, the terms of trade have been getting harsher actually. The natural question that comes to mind is, was that our own doing? That is something that maybe you could touch upon, but we look forward to your initial remarks, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I thought I'd touch on aid by giving you some personal examples, but start with the fact that we have had periods in which aid has been effectively utilized, and we've had rates of growth in Pakistan, which without that foreign assistance would not have been possible. But that period in which we utilized assistance wisely is a period to which some of the donor countries hark back with a great deal of nostalgia. When I was in Germany, one of my principal tasks was really to focus on how our economic relations with that country could develop and what use we made of the assistance that they offered us every year. And one of the older generation of economists in their aid agency said to me that, you know, Pakistan was the model country for us. That is why when Chancellor Erhard talked about inviting guest workers to Germany, one of the first countries that he thought of was Pakistan. That particular idea didn't materialize, but it gives you an idea of how they thought that we had an effective labor force and we had effective utilization of the assistance we were receiving. So the story he gave me ran as follows, that we would say that we are going to give you 400 million Deutschmarks as assistance for the year. You would come to us and say, no, look at the projects list that we've drawn up. All of them are designed specifically for the sort of assistance that Germany can provide, and therefore this sum should not be 400 million but should be higher. We would have discussions on this, and eventually we would end up saying, all right, we'll give you 450 million. Then we would look at the project and we would say, no, this doesn't look good. We have the following objections, and within days we would get a response to all the objections that we had raised, and eventually in these negotiations we would end up with the Pakistani alternative much more often than the German one. Now he said our position is as follows, that we say we are going to give you 500 million Deutschmarks. Nobody questions that. Nobody says that do we need more. But they say that now, and we tell you that we've committed 500 million, this means you're going to pay 0.5% a year for our commitment charge. That you will have to pay the day we say that 500 million Deutschmarks has been reserved for you. Then we say, now, we've given you this 500 million, where are the projects? And 6 months would pass, and we would then raise the question with greater urgency, and eventually you would come up with a project, or our people in Pakistan would go to you and say, how about this project? And with that project, they would say, leave it with us, we'll come back to you. And it would take another 6 months before it came back, with some commas and full stops changed. And the end product was that at the end of the year, of that 500 million Deutschmarks, on which you paid 0.5% in interest every year, much of it would remain unutilized, and the utilization rate became so poor that we had problems in the next year of trying to secure the similar commitment for the future. Therefore, what I'm trying to say is that all the points that Masuma made were absolutely valid in terms of the fact that the 0.7% has never been met, that a lot of aid has remained tied, though there have been efforts at untying aid and making it subject to contracting. But in the ultimate analysis, it depends on how effectively the recipient country is able to push its case for the utilization of the assistance. And on that, I think, I don't think that this is a facet which is isolated in itself. I think the general deterioration that we've had in governance, this particular facet has also found reflection of that decline in governance capabilities, or in perhaps the desire to govern effectively. But I think that now another facet, as these are the opening remarks, so I thought I'd touch on that, that I think we have had a great change in terms of interstate relations and what determined those interstate relations. Up to 1991, or let's say the end of the Afghan War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union into the Russian Federation and the other republics, it was very largely a Cold War game. You were with us or against us, and therefore most interstate relations were determined by whether you were with the Warsaw Pact or whether you were with the NATO countries. And this equation then determined what your aid relationship was going to be, what your trade relationship was going to be. But I think since then, there has been a fairly dramatic change, partly the World Trade Organization, WTO, partly the globalization. All of that has led to a much greater emphasis on trade and on relations between nations being dependent on the volume of trade that has been generated. I wish I could say that for Pakistan also this is held good. Unfortunately, it does not. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, we have still become stuck in a position where, and I'm being very candid here, where the world thinks of us, and there's been a considerable improvement over the last couple of years, but we must recognize that this is that the underlying concern still remains, though in somewhat muted form, that Pakistan is an area of instability. I think most recently this was underlined by President Obama's remarks that this is an area which will remain unstable for some time to come, and our advisor on foreign affairs contradicted him and said that he is not aware of the changes that are taking place on the ground. But the fact is that this is how we've been regarded, and this is how our relations with much of the world are being determined. Perhaps one element of this, and this brings in the question of aid, is our negotiations in Dubai on the IMF program. They gave us another $500 million, or at least have submitted that proposal to their board. that a $500 million under the old program, IMF program, should be released, but raised concerns about the fact that you have not gone ahead with the nationalization, or with the privatization of the distribution companies. You haven't moved towards the privatization of some of the public sector enterprises that you had promised you would be doing, and said that this is a matter of concern. And the reports, the newspaper reports suggested that at this particular time, nobody wanted to insist on Pakistan meeting all the conditions, because if Pakistan did not receive the assistance, then there was a prospect of further instability in Pakistan, which the world could not afford, not just Pakistan, but which the world could not afford. That's an unfortunate position, particularly given that for the rest of the world, I think the focus has changed from relations based on how far you're prepared to support me politically to how far can our relations develop economically. But we are still in an older frame. One element of that older frame is also, of course, the fact that Masuma didn't give the figures, but we have received large dollops of assistance, but we have also borrowed very largely. So that today our foreign loans, our external loans are in the neighborhood of $66 billion. And putting this and our internal borrowing together, we exceed the limits that Parliament had laid down for us. I'm not sure as to what the figure is, but we have exceeded those limits, and we have to sort of return to the financial discipline will enable us, which will be one element of returning to the sort of stability where our relations will now be determined, as are determined in the rest of the world, by the prospects for trade, prospects for economic collaboration, rather than by fears of instability within our country. I'll stop there and let Salim offer us remarks on the other elements of trade. And
thank you very much, and very precise comments from both the speakers before me. I'll just change the context a little. The nature of international economic engagement actually has changed significantly in the last 3 decades, the decades of globalization. Last year, the total aid made available by the OECD was $150 billion. Now, against this, foreign direct investment was $450 billion, and remittances in emerging markets, and remittances from workers back to their home countries in emerging markets was $300. So against the aid of 100, we've got $750 billion of other flows. Now, in relative terms, workers' remittances were always significant going back, but foreign direct investment was insignificant. It's really it's 3 times the size of aid flows, and it's really arisen, accelerated from the middle 90s onwards, particularly after the opening of China, but it's now perhaps the fastest growing segment of the global economy, because value chains, which is where multinationals invest in a matrix of, where is it cheapest to make something, where do we make the next stage, where we have to add more skills, where's the best place to design, what's the best way to market. So a product skips several frontiers before it gets sold, and this is managed by multinationals. Until now, we've had a big powerhouse of bank financing, commercial bank financing, funding all these multilateral flows. Now, overseas investments for the major economic blocs are very significant. For the US, it's about $6.2 trillion, their holdings of foreign investments. For Germany, $2 trillion, for Japan, $1 trillion. Now for China, which has come from, zero about 10 years ago, it's $750 billion so far, and rising. And they moved on from investing in or looking for natural resources and commodities in Africa and places in Latin America, which is where their initial investments went. They moved on to investing in Europe and in America, buying companies, actually locking themselves into buying higher technology by actually buying the company. So if China gets to the same level of investment, average for FDI to GDP as the UK, as the US, Germany and Japan, then China will invest something like $3.5 trillion to reach that level, which on an average is 35% of GDP, and they're only at 750 now, so there's a lot more to come. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that we hadn't, as a country, got into these value chains. You take a country like Vietnam, Vietnam's exports and our exports, there was a difference of $2 billion in 2000. So we were at about 5-6, Vietnam was at about 8-9. Today, Vietnam's $180 billion and we're 25. The difference is, specifically, the difference is the foreign companies who come and invested in Vietnam to take advantage of their cheaper labor, disciplined labor. And this is Japanese companies, different international companies, making pieces of goods along the value chain of the final product. Now, to look to the West for aid is actually, it is fading in significance as an economic lever. We will still need, partnership. We are still dependent on the advanced countries. By we, I mean the emerging markets. Perhaps our exports are growing, we're getting foreign investment, we don't need aid, but we need market access. And so the FDI investment and FDI investment will come. Market access is what we have to negotiate. But if we have multinationals investing, then multinationals buying back into their home country will be an easier form of market access rather than us trying to negotiate that market access as an end in itself separately. The other aspect of this is that the developing world is under very severe strain. Japan's been negative growth or no growth now they had the first lost decade, which was the 90s, then they had the second lost decade, which was the 10s. Now they're in their third lost decade. Japan's been without growth for 25 years. The EU has gone that way in the last 7 or 8 years. They're facing deflation. Their economies face the prospect of actually shrinking. Growth is very, very low. They're trying to push inflation so that producers get signs that demand's rising, but it's not happening. So the Eurozone now has had negative interest rates. The central bank pays negative interest rates to banks keeping reserves with it. And that will, sooner or later trickle down to consumers. Why are they doing that? They're doing that to persuade consumers, spend your money today, otherwise, because they may not be, you'll have less in the future. So they're trying to stoke inflation. They have a target of 2% inflation, and in reality, their price levels are rising by less than 1. There's pressure on the welfare state, severe pressure in Europe on the welfare state, because they don't want to let the multinationals up. They don't want to raise corporate tax rates because the multinationals will go elsewhere. They'll just relocate elsewhere. So they can't raise corporate tax rates. All they can do is raise indirect taxes, which hits the consumer, and also cut back on welfare. So they have all those pressures. They have a negative birth rate. Japan's had one for a while. Europe's now slipping into a negative birth rate. By 2017, migrant births in Europe will exceed births of the indigenous populations. So, you have all those political pressures that you're seeing from the right to left. In all this, the priority that's going to be given to aid is going to diminish, in particular, as, when European countries and all aid-giving OECD countries can see that there is a very viable alternative to aid, and that's foreign direct investment. So that's I think, the major shift that's taken place in terms of what will help emerging markets grow. Unfortunately, as I said, we have not, as Mr. Najimuddin Sheikh explained, we haven't demonstrated very good use of aid in the past, and we haven't managed to get into this global, value chains either. So we haven't enjoyed the benefit that the Asian countries have enjoyed. I just described Vietnam. It's the same story in Thailand, same story in Malaysia. I mentioned Vietnam because it started in the 90s. It was a basket case. It was still a communist country, still licking its, recovering from 30 years of war. Now, as for the aid that comes, the opportunity is that we can, since we don't need it for growth, or we need less of it for growth, if we play our cards right, if we attract foreign direct investment, this aid can then be much better targeted on social infrastructure, health, education, livelihood development, targeted social protection, provided we have the institutional capacity to carry that effort through. And on the institutional capacity, I was asked to say a few words on the China program. The China program, $46 billion plus ancillary expenditure, because this is the main features of the program, but you'll need land, you'll need steel, you'll need metals, minerals, you'll buy a lot of stuff from the local market. So add another significant percentage to that. If we're going to spend that in the next 8 to 9 years, then we have to look at our capacity to be able to hold a program together which will involve increasing our investment to GDP ratio from about 2.5 and 3 to 6 or 7. That needs incredible organization. Just the China program, there are several strands of it, and it will be implemented through, in some cases, central governments, some cases provincial governments, different departments of government. It could really become a very difficult thing to hold together unless it is today pulled into a single entity for coordination. The single entity will not call it the Infrastructure Development Authority of Pakistan, but that will not approve the projects, but that will coordinate timing, pacing, look ahead to see what the import needs are, mobilization needs are, do we have the contractors, do we have the engineers, do we have the skilled labor, so that the whole process moves in tandem, and we don't have some things held up because attention's been devoted elsewhere, as has been happening with our power projects all the time. This gets held up, that goes ahead, then the cost overruns here become colossal. We can't have that happening because we're going to spend in a quantum 3 or 4 times more than we have been spending. So that's one very critical capacity we have to develop if we're going to utilize aid, given Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh's mentioned examples. If we're going to make a success, of this colossal program, many times, we just have to look back to the early 60s. If we have done something like this, in relative terms, something similar in scope, and that was the first 7 years of the 1960s, Mr. Ayub Khan, between Mr. Ayub Khan's rule, between 1960 and 1967, we built 2 dams, which are bigger than anything we've built now. We created IDBP and PICIC, which set up 150 textile companies, dozens of cement companies, lots of sugar plants. And this is all done, coordinated. The aid given was used well. It was executed precisely. So, we had the capacity, but this WAPDA is not the WAPDA we had then. This planning commission doesn't have the power of the planning commission as it was then. So some institutional change actually there has to take place. And again, critically, one missing piece in our financial capacity is the capacity for long-term, for being able to analyze and appraise long-term projects where the risk is the project. What we call long-term project lending is lending to power plants against government guarantees. There's no project analysis there. It's like buying a government bond. Most countries in the world have at least one in the government sector, long-term infrastructure lending organization. India has 3 or 4 at the apex level, and each Indian state, most Indian states, have one of their own. We don't have one for the country. And our banks are busy lending to the government. More than 2/3 or about 2/3 of their exposure is to government in one form or another. So where are they going to find the capacity to lend billions, hundreds of billions of rupees long term to these projects that are going to be coming on board? And I think I've overshot the time allocated to me.
I thought that those were valuable interventions. Thank you, Salim Saab and Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh. I think it is precisely due to these reasons identified by Dr. Masooma, Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh and Mr. Salim Raza that we end up meeting the IMF again and again. So here is a country with the longest relationship with the IMF, and this is something which we need to ponder about. While I have several questions, but I think I'll only pick up one and let you be in the seat where you could ask them the questions probably, because I'm being told, and here is another example of program delivery, I'm being told that I should leave as soon as possible, otherwise PIA will leave me behind. So I guess after asking this question, My question was, of course, to Dr. Masooma. Once I've asked this, I'll request Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh to probably moderate this and pick up the questions from the floor. So I wanted to touch upon the issue which both Salim Saab and Najmuddin Saab picked up on, which was the capacity to conceive, design and execute projects in the public sector. If the view that comes out is that this capacity has been declining, this is where I wanted intervention from Dr. Masooma, given that she has been part of the civil service for so long. What may be the reasons that public sector's capacity to lead these mega projects has actually declined over the years? Dr. Saba, please.
In the first place, I'd like to endorse what Najmuddin Saab said, I think, about capacity. One of the reasons why aid has not reached where it should have reached, that is to benefit the poor, and that is how I look at it, is precisely the fact that the state does not have the institutional capacity to lead in these projects and to execute these projects. Now, there are many reasons for that. Some of them are external. According to some analysts, the reason why local expertise is not viable or is not forthcoming is because too much foreign expertise is imposed on us. That is one reason that is given by analysts.
Absolutely.
The other reason is, and although, mind you, my colleagues are absolutely right, very large projects of great significance have been carried out and funded by donors. And that was also a requirement of our own country. We wanted those big projects to be funded, like the Tarbela Dam, for instance, like the other dams that Salim mentioned. Yes, it was our need. We wanted them to be funded. But with respect to other projects, there could have been local solutions. And there are those alternative solutions which are not, do not accompany such large funds. When you handle a lot of funds, when you handle large funds, then you need the institutional capacity to be able to be transparent in using those funds. And that is unfortunately not the case, not only in Pakistan, but in many of the donor countries. It is not there. The other aspect is that, as indicated by my colleagues here, at one time the situation was better, but that today we lack that institutional capacity. And I would then go along with Najmuddin Saab and agree that there has been a deterioration in governance. And so these conditionalities are also imposed by the donor agencies, by the donor countries. For instance, the loan that is given to Pakistan by the EU recently, it was linked to the fact that there should be better governance, that there should be higher standards of administration. And how they judge that is, of course, another matter, but these were conditionalities. In the same way, there have been conditionalities with respect to governance and to institutional reform by the multilateral lending agencies also. And if you don't conform, and if the economic scenario doesn't improve, then structural adjustment programs are slapped on a country like Pakistan, which create even more poverty. Because what they do is that they go into conditionalities like privatization of public sector enterprises. They do away with subsidies on food and other commodities. They cut wages. I'm just giving a few instances. They cut wages. They institutionally damage some of our infrastructure. And that is why, as I said before, if the government is strong, if the receiving government is strong, and the Indians are noted for that, if the receiving government is strong, it can negotiate better terms. But a government should negotiate terms if it has the capacity to carry out those terms. But if, as Najmuddin Sahab said, there is somehow a deterioration in governance, and I would consider it overall deterioration. It is not only linked to aid. It is not something that can be restricted to the administration of aid, the weak administrative structures which cannot administer aid properly. It is overall, it is across the board, and that is a bigger debate.
Thank you, Dr. Masuma. I think perhaps, Salim, would you like to say something else before we open the discussion to the floor?
No, let's open.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing that, and it's a cliche. We have to set our house in order. Today, our tax structure provides us 9.5% of GDP. Today, our bank borrowing by the government takes up, as Salim pointed out, more than 2/3 of the monies available with the banks. The banks are very happy. They make their money quite safely, but in the process, the private sector is starved of this, or the country is starved of the sort of investment that the private sector should be making. We have public sector enterprises whose losses amount to 600 billion a year. Now, these are things that must be set in order. I'm not suggesting that you necessarily have to privatize, but if you don't have to privatize, you have to set them in order at least, so that rather than making these losses, they give you at least a modest return on the investment that has been made. So, what I'd like to see is that we should now be in the same structure of international trade as most of the countries have graduated to. That our relations with us should be determined by economic collaboration rather than by concerns about our instability. That is what we should be aiming for. And for that, I think we need both better, more effective administration and a recognition of the fact that our financial house has to be set in order. I'll stop there and open the floor to questions. Please identify yourself and
Is it working? Yes, thank you very much for the presentations. Just had a couple of points on the presentation by Dr. Masuma Hassan. My feeling was that what she mentioned was true, but it was a bit too one-sided, if I may say so. She spoke on the ineffectiveness of aid, saying that conditionality was a problem. But the truth is that it depends on the country itself how much it wants to do, what is the ownership of the program of the country, and not just look at it as conditionality that is imposed from outside. Secondly, she mentions aid as being tied in an exorbitant way, that consultants, international consultants, are thrust upon the country. The expensive goods and services are sold to it. I don't think that is true to a large extent. There is international competitive bidding that takes place for goods and services, and in many cases, if not in most cases, the effort is made to try to have services that are appropriately priced. The truth is that aid can be successful or it cannot, and it depends on the recipient country. Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh mentioned that there are cases in Pakistan of successful aid examples and also unsuccessful ones. That, as Mr. Salim Raza mentioned, it depends on the capacity that exists in the country, and the examples of Tarbela and Mangla dams in the 60s are examples of aid that is not only considered excellent in this country, but worldwide as examples of aid effectiveness in an appropriate way.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. May we give Dr. Masuma a chance to respond?
I think you've only listened to one part of my presentation. I did say that there have been very successful instances of aid being utilized in an effective manner in Pakistan. I did mention Tarbela. Yes, there are other instances, Tarbela, other dams. All I was talking about was the general trend of aid. This is my experience. I'm talking from my experience. There have been successful instances, and I did mention that the lack of administrative capacity in Pakistan is an important factor in the fact that aid has not, I think, reached where it should have reached.
Thank you. Please.
So I'd like all three esteemed panelists to share their views about three very important notions that are going around. First one, as Dr. Najmuddin Sheikh mentioned, that our external debt has risen to $66 billion. There's this notion going around that if it exceeds ahead of $100 billion, we might be in a position whereby we might let go of our nuclear assets. Two more points. Number two, I want all the panelists to comment on the privatization of PIA, how it can be done in a better way. And the third is there any way for us to come out of the circular debt?
Thank you. Perhaps Salim would like to...
Yeah. You know, the debt to GDP, this 60%, which is the sort of golden rule, I mean, there's no basis for it really. It just happened to be what the debt of France and Germany was at the time they were creating the euro. So France and Germany are responsible people, so all European countries coming into the euro have to converge at this debt level. It's been ignored thoroughly. Most European countries are at 80 or 90%. So 60%, first of all, 60% there's no magic to it. No, 60% of GDP. So $66 billion in our case, I don't know, we say we are 64, 65% of GDP. That is not, doesn't measure, debt is measured by your repayment capacity, not by the size of your house, but how much cash you've got to be able to repay your debt. And there, what do we look at? We look at space available in the banking sector. We look at government's capacity to raise revenue in order to pay back debt. And in both cases, the situation is dire, and those two ratios matter much more. Our banking sector, our domestic debt, which is about 42% of GDP, is far bigger than our banking sector, which is 32% of GDP. So our debt, and this is the case nowhere else. In the US, debt might be 105% of GDP, but the banking sector is 250% of GDP. So we've already crossed one real danger signal, which is that our financial space, our debt swamps our financial space. Second, as far as the government's capacity to repay any debt is concerned, it's nowhere in sight, even the beginning of capacity, because the first sign of beginning capacity to repay debt is if you have a current account surplus. In budgetary terms, a current account surplus is when your revenues less expenditures before debt servicing are positive, and ours are negative, and they're staying negative. So I would suggest that is Pakistan heavily borrowed? Yes, the 60% is something to bear in mind, but it's one yardstick and the least important yardstick.
The other two questions, would you like to
on circular debt, of course, it should be paid back. The question is how? How much of a deficit do you want this year? When you've committed a figure to because how will you pay it back? You'll pay it back by overdrawing, by debt.
And the third is...
the third, PI, I think Masuma is Dr. Masuma Hassan is the right person to answer that.
What was the question?
PI is the government going about it.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
I think from PI to nuclear assets is rather a quantum jump, but...
I didn't catch about the nuclear assets.
There's this story going around that if our external debt exceeds $100 million, we might be in a position to
on sovereignty. Privatization of PIA and privatization of public sector entities has been part of the conditionality of many aid-giving countries. And as I have heard recently, many governments before this government had also pondered over it and had pledged to do it. I can understand actually the dilemma of the government, and that is that it is landed with an agency or a company which has in it so many people who are not wanted. They've been employed for other reasons. They have not been employed for their professionalism or for their technical efficiency. They are not people who have anything to do with the airline business. But on the other hand, there are these unions, and I believe there are many, many unions in PIA, not just one, and unions in different categories of professionalism, who have all now joined together and have brought the airline to a halt. So, not being a wizard in this field, I would only say that it needs a great act of statesmanship to somehow find a way out. I don't know of any other example of an asset, a national asset, which is as important as PIA, having been privatized in this fashion. But one needs a lot of wisdom. I don't know whether slapping the Essential Services Act is the right thing to do, because that has not broken the back of the unions. And I have always believed that there is a lot to be said about dialogue. And I think that if there is statesmanship and there's wisdom at the top and there's dialogue, maybe these unwanted people can be given a golden handshake.
You know, let me just add that you've had successful privatizations. You had HBL, you had UBL, and from loss-making enterprises with large bad debts, they've emerged as reasonably successful banks now. I think one of the things that I would like to see, and one of the things that I would like to see because of what has been appearing with regard to PIA, is that the government, before it attempts anything of this nature, should put out a white paper providing all the information. Now, yesterday I saw a program which said that the Roosevelt Hotel is being valued at X, whereas it is worth 10X. Or the hotel in Paris is being valued at A, whereas it is 5A. Now, these things need to be addressed, because you then create the climate of mistrust. And you have to restore governance so that you can tackle this. I'm sorry, we don't have much time, but I just want to say one word with regard to your nuclear thing. Please don't make that quantum jump. No 100 billion, no 200 billion is going to be written off on the basis of sale of nuclear assets. Sorry, here, first row.
All right.
I just want to make a point. I think, and I say this most respectfully, that you may be ignoring one thing, that this country since 1980, and it's now 35 years, has been in a state of war on its border. The Soviet Union showed up over there. They stayed there for 10 years and devastated our northern areas. The United States is here now since 9/11. There was not a single suicide bombing in Pakistan before 9/11. So all your facts and figures that you're quoting out here, you're quoting for a normal situation country. This is not a normal situation country. And you can see the world around. You cannot name me another country like Pakistan, what it is enduring. So most respectfully, I say, all your numbers, it don't mean anything to me.
Okay. Thank you. That's a good point of view. Last question. Yes, please. All right.
सर एक छोटा सा क्वेश्चन कि हमने पाकिस्तान हैज़ नेवर डिफ़ॉल्टेड टू एनी इंटरनेशनल डोनर एज सच, लाइक यूरोप में जैसे किया या साउथ अमेरिका में किया कभी, और ना ही हमने अपने हाउस को ऑर्डर में किया. Now, neither we did make our house in order. So why would we make our house in order, and why should they want us to make our house in order?
Well, I think,
couple more questions.
yeah.
एक और ले लें.
Got only 2 minutes left.
Okay.
एक और ले लें, एक और
I
ले
think, the question is really.
लें. I think there's a lady over there.
There's a lady.
All right, let's try and.
Let's, gender balance भी तो होना
The
चाहिए.
lady.
Gender balance बिल्कुल होना चाहिए, so.
Thank you so much. My question is related to the human rights related obligations under agreements like the GSP Plus. How do you view them? Thank you.
Yes, the GSP Plus is linked to the human rights obligations, and
Child labor.
Pakistan is supposed to ratify, observe human rights laws, ratify human rights conventions, labor rights, and other conventions which deal with human rights. I don't know how they are going to finally assess whether we've done it or not. The ratification can be done easily, but the implementation of it is another matter.
Look, at the moment, what happens is that we have 28 protocols associated with the GSP Plus. These are EU conditionalities. But as in the case of the IMF, many of them not fulfilling, many of them may still not mean the withdrawal of GSP Plus, because at this particular time, the agencies or the donors or those who are giving us this benefit are afraid of, will condone these failures, because they believe that at this time, trying to ensure a measure of stability in an area that has been wrecked by war or near war conditions is what they need to do. But this does not change the fact that we need to move towards fulfilling these conditions and towards restoring the governance, which really should not have been affected, which was affected for other reasons, because we chose, our political masters chose to move in a particular direction. But let me, I'm sorry, I've received 2 signals saying that you've got a minute left. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for being a very attentive and a very
Responsive audience.
responsive audience. I wish we could have been more responsive to the questions that you have, but the shortage of time makes it difficult. Thank you again, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you.